Hello and welcome to the Ignatius Press podcast. My name is Ben Eriksen and I'm the manager of this podcast. And today I'm joined once again by one of our beloved authors, Dr. Peter Kreeft. It's good to have you again, Doctor. Thanks for joining us.
You're welcome. It's good to be here.
Today we're discussing one of your new books, What Would Socrates Say? An Introduction to Philosophy by the Socratic Method. And I know that we should never judge a book by its cover, but I couldn't help but notice the cover of this book is quite interesting. It's Socrates talking with another young man, a modern man, and they're sitting on a log. So can you tell us what the story is behind that image?
That is an image of the ideal university, which I call Socrates University. The essence of a university is the relation between a teacher and a student. Surrounding that relationship, all modern universities, even the smallest ones, have erected a very complex structure of economy and law and buildings and whatnot. I have reduced the university to the simplest thing, a log, with Socrates on one end and the student on the other. That is my ideal university. No middlemen.
Yeah, when you see the university today, then you I assume, see issues with it because a log is much more simple and even natural compared to the lecture halls of today's university.
I think if Socrates were reincarnated and we gave him a tour of a modern university, he would say, do you still have philosophers? I was one of those things. And we said, yes. And he said, where are they? And I would say, well, they're in the philosophy department. And he would say, the philosophy what? I said, the philosophy department. He would say, what is that? And I would say, well, it's a bunch of rooms, and the philosophers are in there. Oh, you mean like a cage in a zoo?
Yeah.
Philosophy is a department, is it? I thought it was all of life. You have a love department too? You have a truth department?
Yeah. I think it is interesting. So when we see this issue with the university, what do you see any solutions to it, especially from like a faculty? I'm a teacher myself, and obviously I was a student. What is there any way to fix some of those issues that you see with the university?
I wouldn't call it fixing issues. I would call it presenting alternatives.
Okay.
When I first came to Boston College, I was put on to a committee which was going to revise the entire curriculum for this very large university. And we met once a week for 2 years, and we produced a 500-page report with a lot of different options, little schools specializing in one method or another, one subject matter or another, little classical schools, experimental schools, to see which one worked. It was totally ignored. The whole thing was just a paper thing to satisfy the lawyers.
Okay.
And the university went on as usual. And I'm told that that's the usual thing that happens in large corporations.
Well, one of the things I was thinking about is actually taken from your book, and something I've kind of thought about as a potential solution is returning to this dialogue and that personal relationship, which is emphasized in this book. You actually write the whole book, or at least aside from the introduction, which we'll get into later, but you write the book in dialogue. Can you explain your reasoning behind that?
Yes. In one word, it's Plato.
Yeah.
I think Ralph Waldo Emerson said Plato is philosophy and philosophy is Plato. And Whitehead said the whole history of Western philosophy can best be summarized as a series of footnotes to Plato. Plato was the first philosopher who wrote complete books that we have, 26 dialogues. We have them all. And they haven't been exceeded. Nobody's done better.
Yeah.
I've tried many possible and many impossible ways of introducing philosophy to beginners, and there's nothing better than Plato's dialogues.
Yeah.
It gives you drama.
Yes.
A ringside seat. And a few philosophers have tried to imitate him, but with mixed results. There's only one Plato. I don't know why people don't try more. I did. I wrote about a dozen books about Socrates meeting other philosophers, and people like them. Sometimes librarians and publishers don't like them because they can't classify them. They're not quite academic and they're not quite popular, but that's all right. So it depends upon, the whole thing flows from the figure of Socrates. Plato is to Socrates what St. Paul is to Christ, the disciple, the evangelist.
I like that analogy. I mean, another analogy that you give is with this dialogue is this image of like a boxing match or an intellectual battle.
Hmm.
And you even, it's not just a dialogue between the two characters, but it's also a boxing match in some ways between you, and you address the reader themselves. I found myself in the introduction, for example, you make a statement saying that philosophy is, absolutely necessary, but then you give an argument for why it's important, and you actually call the reader out for saying, "Hey, why are you agreeing with me when actually I'm not providing that argument?" So it's fun to engage with this book because you are engaged as the reader too.
Literary critics say that's cheating. The author shouldn't talk directly to his readers. Dostoevsky does it all the time, and he's one of the greatest novelists ever. So I did. I paid no attention whatsoever to the critics. It was only the critics, by the way, in the entire world that disagreed with the judgment of four polls, most of them worldwide, that asked in the year 2000, what is the greatest book of the 20th century? And the answer was, in all four cases, The Lord of the Rings.
Mm.
And when the critics heard it, they said, that's impossible. That's juvenile junk. But everybody likes it, except the critics.
Well, it shows you sometimes what the judgment of the critics means. Like you're talking to a big Lord of the Rings fan here too. So I love it. I see. I mean, actually, the older I get, it's a little bit of a tangent, but the older I get, I loved it when I was younger for the fantasy, but the older I get, I see that it kind of returns to those perennial truths that he was trying to elaborate via fiction. So anyway, a little bit of a tangent, but
Yeah, there are many depths to it, like the ocean. Yes.
yes, well, I think all the great works are. I mean, going back to Plato, using this style does refer back to the greats. And, I myself refer to Plato and start some of my own courses with Plato's dialogues because of that engagement. And I think that's one thing I really like about your books is that they're very engaging with that dialogue.
There are other philosophers that may be as clever as Plato, but they don't have the psychological depth. The characters don't come alive. They don't spring off the paper and dance in front of you. And
Yeah.
Plato's characters do come alive. That's because Socrates is not only a philosopher, but an evangelist. He's trying to save your intellectual soul. He's dealing with persons, not just ideas.
And that comes through in the work that you've written. And so I'm curious, can you introduce us? Obviously, some of us are familiar with Socrates, but also can you introduce us to your other character as well and how you kind of came up with him?
This is the one I call Nat Whilk, right?
Yep. Nat Whilk, yeah.
Well, the name gives you the answer to the question because Nat Whilk means I know not who.
Mm.
So I don't know who he is. He's just a very average person that I made up for myself, an uneducated but willing and open-minded student,
Yeah.
who is willing to follow the argument wherever it leads, which I think is very rare. Students are so ideologized nowadays that supposedly secular and intellectual debate is really a kind of religious fight.
Yeah.
Because people have religious passion for their politics and not for their religion.
Yeah. I've certainly found that. So when you are engaging with Nat Whilk, you talk about some of these more personal aspects. Socrates does have a personal relationship with Nat. What's important about that personal relationship when we're talking about philosophy?
Well, the specifically Socratic relationship is not simply one of the one who knows and the one who doesn't know. It's not just downloading information. It's coaxing out the wisdom that lies at least as a potentiality, as a kind of little baby, out of the interlocutor's soul. Socrates is like a father, and the father doesn't simply make a child as an author makes a book. He deposits a seed in the bank, and it's the most incredible bank ever invented. It's called a woman, and it grows, and then it has growth outside the womb in the interaction with the father and the mother and the rest of the world. And Socrates applies that to ideas. Ideas, too, need to grow. They start as baby ideas.
Well, and Socrates himself talks about being like a midwife, right? Like this idea of encouraging, the ideas in his students so that they come out and they come out well and not just ideologically forcing certain ideas on people. And I think that's really the task of a good teacher, not just a good philosophy teacher, but a good teacher in general, is to, cultivate that love of learning.
It's also the most successful one because even if you're listening to somebody that you know is smarter than you, and you very much suspect or even come to believe that they are right and you are wrong, there's something in you, the ego, that resists that relationship of losing. He's won the debate, I've lost the debate. But in Socrates' midwifery, nobody wins and nobody loses. The obstetrician and the pregnant woman are allies in producing the baby.
Absolutely. And I think the other thing, there's an aspect of like co-journeying, right? Like it's not just like this master and the apprentice, and the master knows everything and the apprentice knows nothing. But even though there is a teacher, there is an accompaniment, right? Like we're both on this path toward the truth, which is complementary.
Asking a question is deeply respectful. It assumes that you know something that I don't know, at least about where your mind is.
Yeah.
I should, my students will always respond to questions that they don't find threatening, that they don't interpret as, I am now going to show how stupid you are, but rather as encouraging. Show me your baby. Oh, what a wonderful baby. I wonder if you dressed in this way, if he'd look better. I wonder if he could learn these words.
Yeah.
You're allies instead of opponents.
I think that's good. And I think that's often missed in conversation, both academic, philosophical conversations, but even everyday conversations. And I think that's, you talk about a couple elements and how to have those debates. But before we go into this, and we've already kind of touched on this, but I think it's such an important point that you make. You have 3 introductions to your work. And I find that very interesting, and they're not easily overlooked. But even before that, you talk about how this philosophy book is an introduction to philosophy. So you talk about epistemology and anthropology, metaphysics, ethics, politics, the whole range. But you say that this work is a very different type of introduction to philosophy. You give, 4 examples, one of them being this book. The other 3 is like a history of philosophy, an in-depth study of a particular philosopher, or an anthology of sorts. Can you explain how this work is different from those other 3?
Yes, the other 3 assume that there's something already in existence out there that you find valuable and you want to understand and master and use. There's nothing wrong with that.
Uh-huh.
But this book is all about the process of philosophizing. Not so much philosophy as philosophizing, which makes it something like Augustine's Confessions, where he gives you the process and not the conclusion. He gives you some conclusions too, but he doesn't just skim the cream off the top of the quart of milk. He gives you the milk, and he gives you the mistakes that he made and how he recovered from those mistakes. So you can identify with the whole process. That takes a lot of time, and you can't do too many things in a small amount of time if you use that method, because the process and the detours and the wrong answers and the way to see that the wrong answers are the wrong answers and then come back and revise it, that takes much longer than simply saying, well, this is wrong and here's the proof that it's wrong, and this is right and this is the proof that it's right.
Yeah.
I'm tempted to do that myself. All so-called intellectuals are. We think we have good arguments, pro and con, and we want to set them up as a kind of a boxing match, and we know what's going to happen. But in this book, I didn't really know what was going to happen. I didn't have an outline. I just had the situation. Here's Socrates, and here is a student who is a little confused about this issue. How would Socrates help the student to find clarity in this issue? I don't know. It's a thought experiment. It's much more imaginative than most philosophy books.
Yeah. And throughout the book, it was interesting. There were some days where I felt more like Socrates reading the book, where like, okay, I see where he's going. And there are other times where I feel very much like Nat, where I have no idea what's going on and I'm confused. And, I could see my older self in Nat, and then I still see myself at him sometimes and learning from the people around me and figuring, I don't know what the answer to this is. So it's wonderful how it's put together.
Plato was fascinated about teaching virtue, and he wondered whether it could be taught at all, and if so, how. And Immanuel Kant, who's a brilliant philosopher and whose ethics is extremely important, said one of the stupidest things I've ever heard any ethical philosopher say, namely, that the worst way to teach morality is by imitation. It's the best way to teach morality. Hang around with a saint, and it'll rub off. But Kant was so rationalistic, he wanted everything deduced from principles and reduced to formulas. and he did a brilliant job at it. But that's not how you learn.
No.
You learn inductively by example from the bottom up instead of deductively, from the principles down.
Yeah. So do you see that this book, the way that it's laid out, is then a model for how one teaches philosophy? Because you have that dialogue, but then even the progression of ideas. Do you see, is that kind of what you envisioned? Or like you said, is this kind of open-ended as you went forward?
Yes, I'm not sure how it would work in an American classroom where you have too many students, but it would work very well, and in fact does, at places like Oxford, where you have a tutor and a student who defends his paper, and there's no time limit. You can spend all afternoon on it, and he learns from the process as well as the content.
Oh, this is, I mean, a personal question too. If you had to give advice for somebody for teaching philosophy, so for the teachers, what advice would you give them then?
Well, I've tried teaching beginners, freshmen, in various ways, almost everything possible and many things that are impossible. And some of them work better than others. For instance, the history of philosophy works better than systematic ideas. But the most practical thing to do is just start with some Socratic dialogues. I found nobody that can resist Socrates. He's just, well, creative, original, open-minded. He's open. He teaches you to be open.
Yeah. He's also very provocative. And this is something that, as a teacher, I found the best teachers that I had were very provocative in a certain way. And not in a negative way. They're not trying to like egg you on just for the sake of it, but to make you invested in what's being said and what's being talked about and searching for that answer together. So they say something provocative to encourage you to respond. And I think Plato does that in his dialogues with Socrates.
My tests and quizzes to my students emphasize provocative things. And there's a kind of student that resists that. When they come across something provocative, they say, he can't possibly mean that. I'll forget it. That's not common sense. That doesn't fit with where my mind is now. And they always fail my quizzes. But sometimes students who aren't that bright do very well on them because they are challenged by those provocative things. Yeah. And they actually enter into it. They may not do it as intelligently as other students, but the fact that they take this question seriously means that they focus on it. Yeah, that provocation is necessary. At the opposite extreme, we have places like Harvard and Yale, which are rated very, very low for intellectual freedom and creativity, and which I believe after the first Trump election, Yale gave their students safe spaces and coloring books and puppies to pet so that they wouldn't feel challenged and agitated. Socrates, on the other hand, loves to make you feel challenged and agitated.
Yeah, that was actually one of my favorite parts of the book, is where it was toward the very beginning. And you said, you jokingly say, well, if you're confused at this point, just give up. You're not gonna do it. And you quickly say, no, like that. I'm joking, right? If you feel challenged, that's actually a good thing. And I think that's one of the temptations of somebody either starting in philosophy or even something, people who've been studying it for a long time, is as soon as it gets hard, to say, this isn't worth my time and skip this and move on. And I find myself, struggling with that temptation at times, right? So
the world is very much like that. In fact, the only teacher, I think, that is more famous and influential and important than Socrates is Jesus. And Jesus used that too. He didn't simply pat people on the head and say how wise you are and I'm with you. Almost all the time, he challenged you. When the disciples are up, he brings them down. And when they're down, he brings them up. And when somebody is certain about something, he's not. And when somebody's uncertain about something, he is.
Yeah.
It's a constant challenge.
I think, too, there's such a lie that young people, or even people in general, but specifically young people, don't want that challenge, right? They do when you challenge them, but not in a way that like, I'm going to stand over here and challenge you, but like, I'm with you to a certain degree. Like, I'm not going to hold your hand, but I'm going to be a guide to some degree, and we're going to travel this together. And I find that if you're able to accompany them, like going back to that midwife imagery that Plato uses, if we have that, they actually love the challenge. They want to be challenged because they feel free to make a mistake, but that you're still going to help them along the way. So I think it's a lie that they want just comfort. I think they actually want the challenge.
Oh, I think we're all conflicted. We want comfort and we want challenge.
Mm.
And at any given time, one of them takes priority and suppresses the other. And in teaching, the challenge should suppress the comfort.
Yeah, yeah. I'm totally in agreement. Well, I wanted to ask you, I mentioned earlier that there are 3 introductions to this book. And, a lot of times I feel like people are tempted to just like overlook the introductions and just get right to the core of the content. But I feel like that would be a big mistake in this particular work. You have one introduction on philosophy, and then you have another one about logic, and then the third one, which is about the Socratic Method itself.
Mm-hmm.
So each one of them kind of have their own specific topic area, and they're loosely related, but they just talk about philosophy, talk about logic, and then talk about the Socratic Method before going into the dialogue. What was your reasoning behind having 3 introductions to this text?
Well, as I think I said a few minutes ago, philosophy to me is more a process than a result. It's not a set of books. It doesn't exist between covers. It exists between your 2 ears in your process of thinking. And what you are after is not simply logical consistency, although that's also a standard. If an idea contradicts itself, it can't be true. But that's just a negative umpire calling a strike. But what about calling a ball and awarding it to first base? How do you do that?
Yeah.
Well, you do that by searching for it. Jesus said, "Search and you shall find," and he was obviously talking about his Father and salvation, but I think it applies also to truth. If you really are in love with wisdom, philosophia, philos is a word for love. It means friendship. And for the ancients, that was the highest form of love, and it was passionate. It was not necessarily sexual, but it was still passionate. So unless you have a passion for wisdom, you're not going to find it. You may get A's on your test, but you're going to flunk life. That's the interplay of the search for wisdom, philosophy on the one hand, and logic as a kind of umpire that has very strict standards, and that's necessary too. But it's not sufficient.
You even talk about the distinction. We're talking about philosophy. You distinguish between knowledge and wisdom. And I thought that was very profound because a lot of people search for knowledge, but they don't search for wisdom. What's the distinction between those two?
Knowledge always comes to an end. Knowledge is specific. I want to know how old the universe is. I want to know whether an asteroid is going to crash into the sun. I want to know how evolution happened and when it happened. Wisdom doesn't leave you satisfied. Wisdom is like the ocean. You explore more and more of it. And it has many depths. And wisdom is always something you have a personal stake in. It has something to do with your life. It always has practical applications. It makes a difference to your life.
Yeah.
William James, founder of pragmatism, one of the most open-minded philosophers I know of, went so far as to say that if a philosophical idea makes no difference to your life whatsoever, if believing in the idea and not believing the idea doesn't cause any change of any kind in your life, then the idea for you is neither true nor false. It's meaningless.
Wow.
By that standard, a lot of philosophy is meaningless.
Yeah. I mean, a couple, your thoughts actually reminded me of a couple things. One of them is your statement that you said philosophy is not necessary, but it's important. And you even said that the important things can be overlooked, like something that's necessary can't be overlooked, but philosophy can be overlooked.
Mm-hmm. Food is necessary. Love is not necessary. You can live without love. You can't live without food. Yet love is infinitely more important than food.
Yeah, you're right.
Yes. Students sometimes tell me that they go home and they tell their parents that they became philosophy majors, and their parents said, "What? Philosophy? What can you do with philosophy?" How do you answer that? And I say, answer that this way. It's true. You can do nothing with philosophy, but philosophy can do something with you.
Yeah. Well, Yeah, that was the other thing that your statements reminded me of. Was I remember in undergrad that one of my philosophy professors pointed out that one of the fundamental issues with the modern philosophers is they try to take reality, like you mentioned Immanuel Kant, and take it in their hand and then crush it, and to be able to master it and control it and to completely understand it. And he said, actually, it's the exact opposite. Reality is so much bigger than you, and it will crush you. And so, like, you have this constant wonder, and like you said, with wisdom, not being satisfied entirely.
Many of our philosophers classify themselves as analytic philosophers, and demand a very severe logical and linguistic exactness. There's nothing wrong with that, but they stem mainly from David Hume in the 18th century Enlightenment, which was highly rationalistic. The reaction to that in the 19th century with Romanticism and the rise of existentialist philosophy is the opposite, the cultivation of mystery. And there are both kinds of philosophers around nowadays. And the cold-hearted but clear analytic philosophers are, well, cold-hearted but clear. And the mysterious philosophers are, well, warm-hearted but not clear.
Yeah.
And people's demand for scientific clarity sometimes gets in the way of sympathy for those deeper and profounder philosophers.
Yeah.
Two philosophers that I deeply disagree with, but I respect as geniuses, have a terrible reputation for clarity, Hegel and Heidegger. They're notoriously difficult, but they're worth studying because they're quite profound.
Yeah. Do you think the ideal philosopher then is one that has a balancing act between something that is both, pragmatic and speculative to some degree, but as you say, also profound and clear? And I think balancing those is very hard.
It's very hard indeed. In fact, since Thomas Aquinas, I don't think there's been anybody whose philosophy is both very clear and very profound.
I think it's one of the most hardest thing. The hardest thing I find in my own writing is trying to balance that, because it's like, okay, I have this idea, but I can't say it, right? Or I can say it, but then it doesn't actually get at the idea that I'm trying to get.
You have to have patience for both reasons. You have to have patience with your errors and your lack of clarity, so you have to keep polishing it. There, the rationalist side has to come out. But you also have to have patience with your inadequacy and your inability to plumb the depths of the mystery. There's always more. You always have to add to and correct and subtract from what you've said.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that kind of just completely destroys that wonder is skepticism. And you talk in this book about a healthy skepticism, or you call it total skepticism, or some people call it relativism or radical skepticism. Can you talk about the difference between those two types of skepticism?
Yeah. It's like the two types of atheism. There are happy atheists and unhappy atheists. The unhappy atheists are still searching, and they realize that the God question is important. The happy atheists think they found the answer, and you can dismiss the whole question. So there's two kinds of skeptics. There's the happy skeptic who has just given up the chase, and everything is nonsense, and all they do is refute. And then there's the unhappy skeptic. He doesn't want to be a skeptic. He wants to know the truth, but he's humble enough to realize that he hasn't gotten much of it yet. He's very impatient. And that's good.
Yeah. Would you say Socrates is then an unhappy skeptic?
Absolutely. Absolutely. He'll tear apart your ideas very gently and with your cooperation, but only in order to clear the table to put a banquet on it.
Yeah.
And we're very impatient with cleaning the kitchen, but not very impatient with serving the food. We're very impatient for preparing the walls for the wallpaper, but when we put the paint or the wallpaper on, that's fun. But it takes more time to do the clearing than it does to do the creating.
Yeah. Well, so if you have a student, so when I teach a philosophy course, one of the first obstacles I come up to is students who immediately go to skepticism, either because they've been, kind of ideologically, induced into this kind of way of thinking, or because they find it difficult. So they say, well, to heck with it, this, I'm just going to embrace this. How do you encourage, so if you're a teacher or you're a parent with a kid who might be leaning in this direction, how do you encourage a healthy skepticism without having to go that far? If they already are in this radical skeptical position, how do you kind of lead them out of it?
Well, I don't think it works for an idea that they know is not going to make much of a difference outside of class. They probably have enough motivation to get an A rather than a low grade, so they'll play along with you, but it won't really settle. The seed won't take root. Yeah. So you start with a problem that they all have experienced. For instance, do we have free will? Or is there predestination or destiny, whether from above or from below? Mm-hmm. And how can the two go together? How, if everything has a cause, can your free choices not have causes? And if they have causes, then they're not free, right? Yeah. On the other hand, if they're not free, then we're not in a drama. We're in a formula. And life has to be a drama. And freedom is a great thing and a human thing. And yet scientifically, it seems impossible. William James has a wonderful little anecdote. He says he himself tried to figure that out and couldn't. And once he dreamed that he was in Boston around the year 1900, where there were a lot of philosophy clubs downtown, and he needed a place to sleep for the night. And he saw a club on one side of the street called the Free Willers Association, and on the other side of the street, the Determinists Club. So he said, well, which one am I going to choose? I don't know. I'm in the middle of the street. I can't sleep in the middle of the street. Well, I guess I better follow the science. Most scientists are determinists, so I'll ask for a room in the Determinists Club. So he knocks on the door. I want a room for the night. Well, you got to join the club. Okay, fine. Well, there's a test. What's the test? Well, you have to tell me why you came here. Well, I came here out of my own free will. Oh, then you can't join. Sign the door in his face. So he goes across the street to the Free Will Association, asked the same question, and said, no, you have a test. Why did you come here? And James says, well, they threw me out across the street, so I had no choice in the matter. So he slammed the door in his face. And he says, I've been homeless and in the street ever since.
Like that. Who is the person that said that? I've not heard that.
William James.
Oh, that's funny. I like that. But I think that goes back to the point we made earlier, which is being provocative, right? Like that encourages.
James was a lifelong agnostic and wrote one of the best books on the psychology of religion ever written. It's still in print and still used. The Varieties of Religious Experience. Huh. If you're open-minded, you're going to be confused.
Yeah. Yeah, but part of that confusion, if you lean into it, is actually good because that gives you that humility to keep searching.
Yes.
So I find it interesting that when I was reading your text, you talked about the Socratic Method a lot because the whole book is the Socratic Method. And in the third introduction, you talk about a certain like kind of cheat sheet, so to speak, for 10 logical principles and 10 psychological principles of the Socratic personal relationship. And I found a lot of these very helpful. And frankly, I wish I had read this much sooner in my life because I would say I totally agree with every one of these. And I find I've had to learn them the hard way. So to just touch on a couple of them, I found these particularly helpful. So one of them was, we'll start with the psychological, for example, that one of the principles of the Socratic Method is that when you're having a debate with people, it's not a personal victory, but it's the search for the truth. Mm-hmm. And I think that this is something that's overlooked is when people, like I remember watching a video on YouTube and this lady was trying to explain how you can use the Socratic Method to win an argument. And I was like, you're missing the point if you're using the Socratic Method that way. That's so wrong. So so one of these principles, I don't know if you can talk about the principle of not being a personal victory, but it's about the truth.
You've already done it. It's just something you do. It depends on your motive. If you're an egotist and you want flattery, then you're going to use everything for that end, including the Socratic Method, which is not designed for that end. And if you are humble enough to want the truth and realize that you don't have enough of it yet, and so that you're a learner, then you're going to use it rightly.
Yeah.
It's as simple as that. Now, I'm not a psychologist, so I can't give you some gimmicks for changing the egotism to the open-minded humility. Mm. But examples of it abound in the history of philosophy. And Socrates is a prime example of that openness. That's another reason why students love the Confessions of St. Augustine. He confesses his stupidity, his mistakes, and they can identify with that. It's a kind of long-living Socratic Method story of his life.
Well, that was one of the other principles is this aspect of humility. And I think that's one that's easily overlooked sometimes when having an intellectual debate is this intellectual humility that one has to have.
Students always laugh when I tell them that since I have ADD, I'm very impatient, especially with the long speeches. So my favorite sermons are the shortest ones. And the shortest sermon I ever heard was a 4-word sermon that God preached to St. Catherine, a late medieval mystic, summarizing all of divine revelation in 4 words, 2 principles. Number 1, I'm God. Number 2, you're not. And I say, which of those 2 is the hardest one to learn? It's the second one.
Yeah, it really is, though. It really is. I mean, I remember just on a personal level, again, these are the things I had to learn. And I wish I just read your book because it would have been a lot easier. But I remember I had my first introduction to philosophy class. I was in undergrad and I had philosophy in high school. And I thought that like I knew so much more than everybody else in the class and I was going to do so well, blah, blah, blah. And I remember the professor, we talked about Thales and everything made out of water. And he opened up the discussion basically saying, how do you prove that the world isn't just made out of water? And I'm like, this is so easy. And I couldn't. And I tell you, that was a huge learning lesson for me as a freshman in college, realizing an obvious truth, which is the world is not made of water, and I still couldn't defend it, right? And that's humility, and that was a good learning lesson for me.
That was lesson 1. That's the lesson that God taught Job.
Yeah.
I'm God, you're not. You're not going to be able to answer the problem of evil because you're not the author.
Yeah, it's so true. But so many philosophical debates are shortchanged because one or both sides have this kind of pride, where I think Socrates kind of is emblematic of that humility.
Yeah. Well, personal pride affects all of us in every sphere, but I think especially today, with the triumph of technology, we use technological success as our touchstone for success in any other field. But there's no technology for philosophy, no technology for the spirit, no intellectual technology. The Socratic method is not like the method of residues in what field is it? Each science has a method for closing issues, settling issues. Mm-hmm. Philosophy's method does the opposite. It opens issues.
Yeah. Well, and I think the temptation is for people to see that and say, well, then we never get answers. How would you respond to that? Because, well, you just ask questions, you never answer anything. How would you respond to that kind of objection?
There are 2 kinds of answers. There are answers to mathematical problems, which once you know, and that's all of it. And then there are answers to philosophical and personal problems, which give you wisdom, and then you have to live it and find more questions and more answers.
Yeah. I think there's one of the other principles you have is that there's deeply personal psychological ramifications for studying philosophy via the Socratic method. And you've touched on that just in that last comment. I don't know if you can explain more that why does philosophy have psychological or personal ramifications?
Well, because philosophy is the love of wisdom, not just knowledge. And wisdom is always about values. And values are something that we humans are the only creatures in the universe that respond to them. Nothing else has free will. Nothing else has a moral dimension. We don't call machines sinners when they fail to function. We just throw them into the scrap heap. But we don't do that with each other. Yeah. So philosophy is about those distinctly human questions. And that's dangerous because we feel rightly responsible for those questions. They're not just games that you have an option to play if you want to. They're questions that you're inside of. You're living them. So in order to know yourself, you have to confront those deeper questions.
Yeah. And I found that the other line that you said about this is that when you find a conflict in philosophy, there's a conflict in yourself. And sometimes you can really feel that. Like if you hold proposition A and proposition B and they conflict with each other, it's not just, 2 ideas conflicting. There is actually a personal conflict that happens that needs to be resolved.
And that's how progress happens. If you're not confused and confronted and confounded, you're not going to move. Yeah. Unless you're challenged, you're not going to respond to that challenge. Arnold Toynbee, a great early 20th century historian, said all of history moves by challenge and response. He said that's one of the reasons why civilization moved faster in Europe than in Africa. In Africa, the climate was warm enough that it had very few survival problems. In Northern Europe, the climate was very difficult for survival, so they had to invent new things in order to survive.
Yeah.
And philosophy proceeds in that same way, I think. The difficult philosophers are the most useful ones. The philosophers that challenge me the most, sometimes the ones that I most profoundly disagree with, like Sartre or Nietzsche, I learn the most from.
I mean, and it's true. There's sometimes where you read philosophy and you'll have existential crises. Like, I mean, there was one recently. I got married a couple of years ago. Like 3 or 4 months into marriage, I was doing some philosophy work in my office, and my wife all of a sudden hears like, "No, that can't be true," from me audibly coming from the other room. And later she's like, "Do you want to?" We were, it was late at night, so we both went to bed. And I was in bed and put my head on the pillow. She's like, "Do you want to talk about it?" And I rolled over. I was like, "No, not yet." And it was like this kind of like personal, like I was reading this text and it challenged me. And the more I thought about it, I'm like, oh man, this is true. And it's an uncomfortable experience, but it's a necessary experience. And it does show growth.
And it's a necessary part of teaching. If your heart's not in it, if you're not moved by it, if you don't find it personally life-changing, you're probably not going to do a good job even on your tests.
Yes. Yeah. I think one of the problems I found with other philosophers, philosophy teachers, is they make it too much of an intellectual activity. That it's more about passing the test and learning ideas than it is about this personal encounter with the truth. And it's kind of, it's almost taking on a religious dimension when you say that personal encounter. But I think that's intentional. Actually, that that truth is God.
Well, the head and the heart have to work together. God is truth and God is love, and those two things are one in Him, but they're not one in us. Which is one of the things that makes Augustine so wonderful. His head and his heart are both profoundly alive. In fact, medieval statues always have Augustine holding an open Bible in one hand and a burning heart in the other.
Yeah. Yeah. My students really resonate with Augustine, I think, for that reason. I mean, some of them are initially put off by the flowery language that he has, but then actually they read more and they're like, no, I actually can resonate with this. And that openness is a little uncomfortable at first, but encourages their own openness in the end.
Yep.
Well,
another philosopher who's not usually classified as a philosopher is like that. G.K. Chesterton. Students are always challenged by him. He doesn't say what you expect. And he uses very poetic and analogical and paradoxical language. And some students are threatened by that. But once they ride the wave instead of trying to conquer the wave, they love it.
Yeah, I think one of the obstacles to understanding these philosophies is not actually understanding them in the first place. And so you talk about intellectual empathy, the idea of putting yourself in the other person's shoes. The temptation with somebody like Chesterton or Augustine or whatever, or even somebody you disagree with, like you talked about Kant or Hume or whatever, is not actually understanding them in the first place and then thinking that you've succeeded by, rejecting them or undermining their arguments, but you don't even understand them in the first place.
Well, there's even a very popular philosophy, deconstructionism, which says that's what you should do. There is no objective truth, so you create your own truth. Don't try to find a Platonic essence. There aren't any.
That's a really sad philosophy.
It's an attack on truth. That comes from Nietzsche, who said probably the most shocking thing I can remember any philosopher ever saying. He said, every philosopher before me agreed about one thing that I disagree about. And this idea of mine is the most dangerous idea I can think of. The idea is this. Everyone says my philosophy is true. Why truth? Why not rather untruth?
None.
What good is truth? Why the will to truth? It's a question of, for Nietzsche, it's a question of free will. You can choose truth or you can choose untruth. And nobody can refute you either way, according to him.
Yeah.
And that's very disturbing, because if you try to argue with that and if you say, here is the reason why you should choose truth rather than untruth, he would say, is that reason true? Well, then you're presupposing truth. Yeah. You can't prove the value of truth. You must presuppose it. I think he's right there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But I think the interesting thing about Nietzsche, which is really tragic, is how much his personal life influences philosophy. Like is talking about the philosophy and how it relates. I mean, your philosophy can affect your personhood, but your personhood
this is his tremendous value. He lived his philosophy, and he showed us, like a prophet, what it came to. It came to literal insanity. The last 10 years of his life was in an insane asylum.
Yeah. Well, I think it's interesting. I often tell my students, you know who came up with the phrase, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. And they said, no. I'm like, it's Nietzsche. And he went insane for the last 10 years of his life. I said, so this idea that, it's kind of not true, right? Like, I mean, the idea, it depends on how you react to it. And Nietzsche just thought it was all about this will to power and not about this continuing relationship and wonder for the truth and opening yourself up to that greater reality and ultimately to God. He closed himself off to that. And that does lead to insanity.
And it wasn't simply an intellectual shut off. It wasn't something like God can't possibly exist because there's too much evil in the world, or I can't believe in God because science contradicts it, or because I find fallacies in all the arguments. It's because his will was not to have God.
Yeah. It's so sad.
He said once, I think this is in Zarathustra, I will now refute the existence of all gods. If there were gods, how could I possibly bear not to be a god? Consequently, there are no gods. Writing the word consequently. It's not a logical consequence. That's a personal consequence.
Maybe it's just because this book is talking about Socrates and now we're talking about Nietzsche. Nietzsche almost seems to be the polar opposite of Socrates. Like
Nietzsche hated and despised two people more than anybody else in the world. He thought they were the truest things ever happened to humanity. One was Jesus and the other was Socrates.
You can see why.
You can see why.
Yeah, you really can. It's really tragic. I mean, this is, I think, when you talk about the importance of philosophy, it's not necessary, but it's important, right? Like you see that lived out in both the lives of Socrates and Nietzsche, right? It really leads to one, personal happiness, right? And one, to absolute misery. It's really tragic. I mean, I think a lot of people despise Nietzsche. I don't despise him. I pity him. I mean, it's really sad.
Well, I think maybe the angels had something to do with that. I think they invented Nietzsche to scare half-hearted atheists into terror. I've met students who said, "I read Nietzsche and I ran looking for a priest."
I would too, honestly. I would too. That's he's not a pleasant place to be, and that's not who you want to end up being like. So,
yeah.
Well, moving on from some of the psychological principles, you also talk about logical principles for using the Socratic method that are employed in this book. And you talk about the 3 acts of the mind and logic. But we don't need to go into those details. I want to talk about, in particular, you say in order to have a good Socratic debate, in order to talk to somebody, you need to first define your terms. And I think that's something easily overlooked in many conversations right now.
The vast majority of mistakes we make in philosophizing come in not in the logic of arguing, and not even in how much you know, how many true premises you have, but in understanding the meaning of terms, which is why Socrates spends most of his time trying to get definitions clear.
Yeah.
That's not just a technical thing. That's a necessary thing in ordinary life. Why do we misunderstand each other? I want my freedom. You can't be free unless you do this. Well, they're using freedom in 2 different senses there.
Yeah.
A fetus is not a person. Yes, it is. Well, what do you mean by a person?
Yes.
Does your sex get determined by your attitude towards it, is a feeling, or by the objective facts about it? Is faith a feeling, or is faith a perceiving, a knowing?
Yeah.
Does it come from your insides, or does it come to you? Fundamental differences, and people are too impatient to argue about them.
I find that when reading your book, I'm challenged because I see in myself the same problems that Nate has, that namely jumping to conclusions. I'm not defining the terms, as you just said. I'm not understanding the arguments. What are ways to overcome that as we're all reading our own text? Or maybe not even reading your book, but we're reading any other kind of philosophical text.
This is why I wrote the book. Apprentice yourself to Socrates. You learn by example.
So by studying Socrates, we can become more like him. It's kind of like osmosis or wearing off.
Yes. If I ever learn to master computers, it will not be by reading books and by trying to follow step-by-step methods. It will be by hanging around computer users who say, I don't know how I do this, I just do it. Well, I'm going to watch you. And eventually the watching helps.
So this is where I think a lot of the modern education system has failed then, because they are all about employing certain strategies
Yep.
or certain technical abilities or things. And it seems to be more of this osmosis and that personal relationship aspect.
The apotheosis of this development is artificial intelligence. We now have such advanced methods of artificial intelligence that the student doesn't even have to read a book. The machine will read the book and guess what kind of questions are going to be asked on the test. And the student can memorize the answers, and most of the cases get a good grade in the test without ever having read or understood the book. We farm out our brains to machines.
Yeah. I actually, this is, again, not specifically about your book, but I'm fascinated by this. I'm deeply concerned about AI when it comes to philosophizing.
Oh,
Because,
so right.
Just as texting replaced communication so that people can no longer communicate with each other, now we're getting to the point that AI is doing the thinking for us. And
Yes.
I mean, there are a lot of people that I know and love very deeply who are using ChatGPT for a lot of things. And maybe I'm an old soul already, but I'm like, I'll never use it. Like, I don't care if it takes me longer. I refuse to use it because of how dangerous I think it can become in training ourselves habitually to rely on our own thought process on something that's mechanical.
More and more people are seeing that and writing cautionary tales about it. Yes.
Yeah. I really worry about young people and the long-term effects that has on them. And um, I also don't know as a teacher how you combat that. Do you assign all writing now in a course because it's so easy for them to go home and write it? You know, it's amazing how many quandaries this puts professors in and students in, and how it can really shortchange education.
Yes. Yes. I found some methods that are somewhat helpful in class, like very creative multiple choice questions, which you wouldn't expect a computer to do. But if you send a student home with an essay problem, he can get chatbot to do it for him, and there it is. And there's no way of proving that he did it or that he didn't do it.
Yeah, yeah. Well, one of the ways I've found, but again, it only works in a small classroom environment where you have a limited number of students, is have them produce an outline and then they have to talk to you about it, right? And if they come to talk to you and they have no idea what's on the page or they can't explain it, well, then okay, that's a pretty good sign that they used something else. But again, for larger classrooms, where you have 80 to 100 kids, that's not possible.
Most good students see the problem and are willing to make those restrictions. Wyoming Catholic College, which is very small and quite select, has a rule: you may never use screens on campus at all. Leave your cell phones home. And many prospective students say, I can't possibly go to that college. But those that do usually say, I don't know if I can endure that. And when they graduate as seniors, every single one of them says that was one of the best things I ever did.
Yeah. Well, for all of the reasons that we know, but I think especially for the intellectual development, it forces them to actually read the text, right? Not rely on ChatGPT, not rely on summaries, right? You actually have to, it forces you to be in that uncomfortable position where you don't know. And that encourages that humility that we've been talking about. It encourages that growth and that dilemma that you have with yourself in order to actually get closer to the truth and not rely on some of these crutches.
And the danger is that if you believe that, if you're suspicious of this dominance of technology, you may go to the opposite extreme and become a 60s hippie and say it's all feeling and nobody's wrong. And in other words, the head and the heart have to cooperate. And when either one dominates the other, you don't have a complete human being.
One of the core elements of your text, which is how the Socratic method helps us deal with difficult people. And you define difficult people as ones that are not just wrong, so they're under an illusion, but they're under a double illusion, namely that they're under the illusion that they're not under an illusion. How does the Socratic method help kind of disarm and address talking to these kind of difficult people, as you put them?
It's role reversal. It's saying, you teach me. I may not understand you. Explain yourself. Why do you believe this? And they're glad to try to evangelize you. Yeah. So we're not the establishment, and they're not the barbarians. They're the establishment, and we're the barbarians.
But it can also be a dangerous game, because when you show that they don't know what they're talking about, they might want to kill you, like they did with Socrates, you know?
Well, that's not so bad. I mean, if students are passionate enough about philosophy to kill some of their teachers, that's an improvement. It's not the right way to deal with it, but at least there's something to be thankful for there.
That's true. That's true.
Suppose Jesus was so boring that nobody wanted to kill him. He'd be a failure.
That's true.
As he himself says, a prophet, there's no profit in being a prophet.
Yeah.
It's risky.
There is a risk then. I mean, there is always a risk in searching for the truth, but there's a risk in teaching the truth. I mean, I think it goes back to the cave. And, they tried to take him out of the cave, and they wanted to kill him because they wanted to bring him into the light. So there is a risk in bringing people toward the truth, but it is worth it. I mean, this is where I think the personage of Socrates and the personage of Christ overlap. They both try to lead people to the truth, obviously in different ways, but they both end up dead because of it. Your book's been really helpful for me reading this. I think it's been really helpful as a philosophy professor. I plan to use this in my own classes too. Again, the book that we've been talking about today is What Would Socrates Say? An Introduction to Philosophy by the Socratic Method, written by Dr. Peter Kreeft. Thank you so much, Doctor, for joining us. I really look forward to talking to you again. It's been another wonderful time.
Thank you for your wonderful questions. It was a good interview, largely because of you.
Thanks, Doctor. God bless.
You too.